Hi, hello, and welcome to the last lecture of Science as Process and Perspective. This one is going to be a little bit longer than the others because we're diving into a really sort of deep and broad topic, and that is what is the influence of the social context on the way that we do science. And I'm just going to be able to give you a few sort of, insights here and there into this topic, not a sort of a systematic overview, but maybe I can raise some interesting questions during this lecture. We've actually already encountered social aspects of doing science before. In a lecture about the standard view of knowledge and science, we talked about Robert Merton's sociology of science, his ethos of science. Later on, when we talked about scientific progress, um, I talked about Thomas Kuhn's scientific revolutions and his criticism of Merton, saying that in order to understand science, you need to pay attention to the activities of scientists. And so these two people, among many others, are pioneers of what is nowadays a very broad and interdisciplinary field, which is called science, technology, and society, working at the interface of the history, philosophy, sociology of science, using anthropological methods, and also using something called science of science, which is the application of scientific methods to the study of scientific activity itself. And despite being really sort of broad and diverse, this field has a bunch of foundational assumptions. The first one is that science is a practice that's deeply embedded in a community and a society. And the norms of science are basically drawn from the practices of that community. So we need to understand the community of scientists if we want to understand science. More recently, communities have become seen as networks of human and non-human actors. We'll talk about this as well. But as usual, let's first ask a few questions before we dive into these topics. The first one is, what social and political factors play a role in scientific progress? What are good ways of setting up science for progress? What hinders progress in science? How do the social political institutions and cultures of science arise? How do they affect scientific progress? The way how you subdivide science into disciplines, how you organize it into institutions. Is pressure to be productive good for scientific progress? Is there something like too much pressure? What are the benefits of inclusiveness and diversity for science? Are there any? Can scientific inquiry be completely rationally and logically formalized, like the standard view of science and technology suggested? Or are there hidden social aspects to it? Of course, we've already been diving into these last questions many times, but more at the individual level. So we're going to focus on the social level today. And maybe the best place to start here is to ask the question, is scientific conduct really governed by Mertonian norms? Okay, so just to refresh your memory, the main norms that Merton postulated in his ethos of science are, first of all, universalism. Criteria to evaluate claims do not depend on the person making the claim, their background, their age, their race, their gender, whatever. Second, communism. Scientific knowledge is commonly owned. You may claim priority and, of course, derive prestige from what you publish. But once you publish, it's out there and everybody can do whatever they want with your insights and your publication. Disinterestedness. Scientists must disengage their interests from their judgments and actions. Otherwise, you get all kinds of biases in scientific research. Organized skepticism. Scientific communities should disbelieve and criticize new views until they are firmly established. But here are four counter norms, sort of the opposite of those norms. Let's look at those and see if scientists really behave according to this ethos of science. The first one is particularism, sort of the opposite of universalism. And so think about this. I mean, of course, it makes sense to look at the expertise, the sort of background, but also maybe the political motives of someone making claims to judge those claims. So particularism, looking at who is making the claim, can be a very good thing when you evaluate scientific claims. Communism, The opposite is secrecy. So let's say you've invested a lot of years and effort and money into creating some sort of data set or a specific theory. Shouldn't you have privilege to sort of analyze the data and draw your own conclusions from that before others get access to it? Think about um, sensitive areas of science, such as studies of viral pathogens. Do you want everybody to be able to download that easily synthesizable genome of a deadly virus? That warrants some discussion. Disinterestedness, the opposite is interestedness, of course. And you can think of many examples where vested interests have done harm in science. For example, the debates about the health effects of smoking, and more recently, of course, climate change, where corporate interests with bad faith have interfered with science and the communication of science to the public. But you can also see the other side, maybe, that a lot of climate scientists are also climate activists at the same time. They're driven by a passionate commitment for action against climate change. And is that a bad thing? Well, it is if it actually biases ideologically the insights they get. But it can also contribute to their motivation, to their passion of doing the science they do, and of course, motivate the questions they are asking. Organized skepticism, the opposite is credulity. But I mean, we do have a set of institutions and titles and that are supposed to sort of tell us if we should believe someone or not. Is that without sense? Should we question all of that? Someone comes with a PhD in epidemiology, we should probably, put more worth on their judgment of COVID and how it works than someone else who, a lot of the amateur sort of people with their, essay on Medium about what would solve the COVID crisis. So there are lots of sort of open questions. Or imagine if we constantly doubt everything all the time, we wouldn't make any progress in science, right? I mean, so there's a certain balance to be established here. And one of the big problems is that mostly you can interpret the behavior of particular scientists or communities in both the norms and the counter norms, which is sort of indicating that there's a problem. So what is the problem? The problem is probably that Merton's norms are more of an organizational myth than an ethos of science. And this seems a little mean as a criticism, but let me explain. So one problem is that counter norms are rarely sanctioned and often even respected, as you could judge from the examples I just gave you. Mertonian norms, social norms, that is, are more often professed to the public rather than actual norms. And so that is a problem. The second problem is that social and also cognitive norms, by the way, of science, they change over time. I was telling you that even the method of judging the validity of theories has changed over time. So Merton's criteria are probably not universal throughout the history of science. Third problem is that science is not a unified institution with a single shared set of goals. It consists of all kinds of different cultures. We'll come back to that later on. And last but not least, Mertonian norms are extremely vague, and there's too much room for interpretation. So you can interpret, you can make your behavior fit into those norms without much problem, and they don't much constrain the behavior of scientists. Actually, they're mostly used as rhetorical resources to argue for the authority of science. What does that mean? So for that, we have to take a step back and first look at Wittgenstein again. Remember the late and the early Wittgenstein? We're looking at the late Wittgenstein. And so in his later phase of life, he was mainly concerned with the philosophy of language. Wittgenstein was studying the way we give meaning to words. And he was saying that actually the meaning of words doesn't come out of clear and precise definitions, but it comes out of what he called language games. So the usage of words between people who talk to each other. So we play with the meanings of words and we throw them back and forth. And the way the meaning of words is established is sort of a cultural phenomenon through their use in language and communication. And Wittgenstein went on to extrapolate that view to the interpretation of norms, such as Merton's norms. And there he finds a problem because he says no course of action could be determined by a rule, because every course of action can be made out to accord with a rule. Rules can always be interpreted, and your behavior, you can always rationalize your behavior to fit to a certain rule. So again, rules are resources rather than constraints. So you use the rules and the norms to justify your behavior, to claim authority, for example. Also, another problem is that rules by themselves, within themselves, do not specify the scope of their applicability. So how do we establish what rules are applied where? It can't just be by, prescription, proposition, like Merton saying this is how it should be, and this is how it is now. So Wittgenstein says rules do not stand above, but are constituted by their application. You only get the rules through practice. And so this leads to this important concept of boundary work that is basically the idea that the interpretation of norms gives rise to the origin of institutions and cultures in science, the practice of living those norms and establishing those norms. Again, norms are used as rhetorical resources. So social and cognitive norms here are used to establish the authority of science by setting it apart from other activities, and also to establish the authority of certain subdisciplines of science by setting them apart from other activities. You're basically using those rules to say, I am the expert here because I am part of this field. Okay? And so norms set and stabilize social boundaries. They're not only used to establish fields, but they're also used to maintain them. Institutions and epistemic cultures grow around shared set of norms. They maintain the integrity of established boundaries. So this is a view that's sort of complementary, I think, to Merton's view. Again, this is an example of two valid perspectives that you can take on a problem. You can look from the top down, the function of an institution in society, or you can look from the bottom up. What are the activities that constitute the different fields of science? And this is work by Gearin, I should have said, and this is his 1999 book, Cultural Boundaries of Science, that treats this phenomenon of boundary work. So the sort of activities that establish boundaries and authority through practice in science. And this leads to science being a fragmented sort of set of different epistemic cultures. This is a term that was introduced by Austrian sociologist Karin Knorr-Cetina. And she asked the question, she took Kuhn's idea of incommensurability. Remember that people that live before or after a scientific revolution, they can't even talk to each other because they completely see the world with completely different eyes. And she's asking, does that apply to people from different disciplines? Are their worldviews incommensurable at times? And she pioneered this sort of anthropological practice of actually going to labs and studying the behavior of scientists. She did this in the field of high energy physics and in the field of molecular biology. And she compared those different fields and concluded that there is no such thing as a unified scientific method. These two fields, they worked in completely different ways. One, huge groups, big experiments, lots of technology, and a completely different way of publishing and assigning authorship. While in molecular biology, you have small groups that work alike to sort of start up companies, increasing the efficiency of producing data in very sort of individualistic ways. Of course, by now she wrote before these big projects came up in biology as well. So she says the different scientific activities are what constitute different scientific disciplines. It's not just sort of the topic, it's not just a difference in methods and tools and the aim of research, but also in how you reason, types of reasoning, ways to establish evidence, what is acceptable as evidence, and the relationship between theory and, oh, damn you, autocorrect, empiry, not empire, of course. So in theoretical, in physics, of course, you have these experiments are derived from theory, while in molecular biology, if you have theory, you have a model that is based on the experimental evidence. Quite different practices. So you have these different subfields. And again, they arise from applying different rules to different areas of science. So it's not okay to just prescribe an ethos to every science there is from the top down. Now, probably the most famous sort of philosopher who does this sort of philosophy as anthropology, who goes to labs and studies people in the lab, is Bruno Latour. And here he writes together with Steve Woolgar in 1979 in their very famous book, Laboratory Life. This is a great, he has great eyebrows. He also has great quotes. And so here is a bit of a longer quote about this motivating this approach that both Knorr, Tina, and he use. And he writes, since the turn of the century, scores of men and women have penetrated deep forests, lived in hostile climates, and weathered hostility, boredom, and disease in order to gather the remnants of so-called primitive societies. By contrast to the frequency of these anthropological excursions, relatively few attempts have been made to penetrate the intimacy of life among tribes which are much nearer at hand. This is perhaps surprising in view of the reception and importance attached to their product in modern civilized societies. We refer, of course, to tribes of scientists and to their production of science. So instead of going to the jungle, you study scientists in their natural habitat. And by doing this, Latour established sort of three main phases of how scientists construct what he calls a scientific fact, what I would call a scientific insight, a perspective, a truth, a perspectival truth. So the first is you have to learn to see. That's the first phase. And here's another great quote from Latour. Much work has to be done to create typical data. So before you even produce a data set, there is lots of sort of consensus finding and informal discussion among scientists to agree on what is it that we're actually looking for in a certain scientific field. That influences the choice of experiment and its controls. It influences the assessment of success. This is very difficult. Remember that we always have our perception colored by our previous knowledge. So our insights are always dependent on previous theory. And so the problem arises here that if you have an experiment that fails, do you sort of throw away, do you falsify the hypothesis it has been testing, or do you assume that you made a mistake somewhere, that something went wrong in the experiment? There's no way to resolve that, really, based on first principles. This is called the experimenter's regress. It's sort of a version of Neurath's boat from the sociology of science. Selection of results. You throw out outliers. I have an outlier on my t-shirt right here. Which are the outliers that you throw out? Clarification, organization of results. How do you organize? How do you put them together? And of course, there's an interesting process that goes from pattern recognition and feature selection to feature selection. For example, the process from going from image to a diagram. If you have raw data to the figure in the paper, there in all of these steps, there are a lot of sort of social factors that work into what he calls the construction of facts. The second phase or aspect of constructing facts is tacit knowledge. Remember, Michael Polanyi said that we believe more than we can prove and know more than we can say. So there is a lot of embodied knowledge, know-how, personal judgments, and passionate commitments go into doing science. And so the problem is that this sort of tacit knowledge cannot be fully formalized as propositions. And so Latour calls this enculturation. He says not all knowledge and skills can be transferred and communicated in an algorithmic way. Social interactions are required to acquire tacit knowledge. So for example, if you work in a lab, you have just received by email from a colleague a new protocol to do an experiment, and you tried it, doesn't work. Maybe you get it to work 20 emails later because there was a lot that was not written down, or maybe you even have to go and visit that other lab if it's a really tricky procedure to learn it on site. And even then you may still have problems transferring it to your new context in your own lab. So there's a lot of unspoken knowledge that goes into that. And Latour calls this the enculturation of the practice of science. And then the third aspect that he looks at is sort of the crystallization of formal accounts. This goes back to older investigations such as Peter Metaware's paper from 1963, entitled "Is the Scientific Paper a Fraud?" He rather provocatively asks, and says that, scientific articles, they make an argument, but are written like a narrative. Now, the problem is real narratives make bad arguments. So the way you actually came to your conclusions was full of dead ends, silly mistakes, things you really don't want anyone to know. And so you adjust your narrative to serve the argument in the end. And in a way, so the fraud here is sort of a self-delusion. You falsify, you misrepresent the way by which you arrived at your results systematically by publishing your results in the way that scientific publications are organized. And so Latour says there's a kind of inversion that occurs towards the end of a research process where you switch from engagement with messy nature and the establishment of facts to the manifestation and representation of natural mathematical order. So we have a huge bias where it's presenting, you know, science as sort of describing the order of things, as Aristotle said, right? So it's a structured account of reality. So there could be a lot of bias in there, and we miss out on all the messy and less ordered parts of reality. And that's just an intrinsic sort of limitation of science. Science cannot, deal with stuff that isn't generalizable. It is intrinsically not reproducible. Okay, so all of this leads him to sort of examine where do our worldviews, our scientific theories actually come from. And he develops a general theory called actor network theory together with other scholars, where, so the first sort of argument that Latour makes is that the sort of social aspects that feed into the production of knowledge are very similar to the social aspects that feed into the production of technology. And so he calls this whole thing technoscience, and sees its origin in the material relations, so of human and non-human actors. Technoscience is produced through the generation of networks between human and non-human actors. I put actors in scare quotes here because he uses the term in a slightly unusual way. So I would think of an actor as an organism that can initiate an action, has some sort of volition. But Latour says actors are more like actants. So they are made to act in a network, meaning that they play a certain role as nodes in the network. Actors are heterogeneous, so they can include human and non-human entities. So you can have, of course, non-human living specimens in biology, but also methods, technologies, okay, that sort of acquire their own, what he calls interests. So actors form associations to form networks, and actors have interests that cause them to act. So I find that really problematic. So interest here, you have to think about, so they have a way to influence the way the network is functioning. Okay, they play a functional role in the network. I would call it that way rather than the way he calls it. But the basic idea is that sort of the way that these different actors act in the network need to be accommodated and managed. And so if aligned properly, these networks turn beliefs into facts. And the question is now, if you want to understand science, you need to understand how these networks are accommodated and managed so that they align. Okay, so what he does here, I mean, to sum this up, what he provides is basically a sort of an upside down version of the standard view of science and knowledge, where we said we have these sort of general theories that, the laws that govern reality. That's the foundation of science in an objectivist realist view of the world. The laws of physics are everything. And here he says, no, these laws of physics and all the other abstract laws that we produce, they derive from relations in material relations. So he calls this relational materiality. And they are the product of actor networks. And he calls these are the social and material worlds that we construct. Okay, so he's very strongly constructivist, especially in his early views. And so you can take this to extremes and say, okay, so this is sort of, while a postmodern scholar would say everything we know is embedded in a social discourse, he says everything is embedded in these more broader, materially based actor networks. It's sort of an extension of the discourse sort of idea. But on the other hand, you can also embed this view, of course, in a sort of a perspectivism, a perspectival realism a la Wimsatt. And you can say, okay, so here you have different actors with different perspectives and they interact with the real world. And perspectival realism gives you some of the criteria, and also naturalistic epistemology give you criteria of how to assess what kind of alignment of these networks, what kind of management of these networks is successful in establishing trustworthy knowledge and what is not. And even Latour himself has sort of swung around in recent decades to more of a view like that, a less extreme view of science as a social construction, more of a perspectival sort of view, I would say. So let's now switch from these very general sort of considerations to aspects of how, how do the sort of interactions in a community align with the interests of individuals, and how fair are those? How much is this sort of ideal of universalism really a reality? How much is science a meritocracy? And that's a problem when you have a science with very diverse perspectives, of course. So here, what I would like to discuss is first is the Matilda effect. It is about the attribution of recognition and prestige in science. The Matilda effect was named by Margaret Rossiter in a 1993 article, and she defines it as a bias against recognizing women scientists' achievement. So a transgression against this ideal of universalism, that who you are very much matters in everyday practice in science. And the Matilda effect is named after 19th century political activist and suffragette Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who wrote an article in 1870 called Woman as Inventor, where she was describing exactly this phenomenon without giving it a name. So the more general, it's not just about women, it's about the attribution of prestige to all kinds of minority views in science. Okay, so if you have a diversity of views, they will not always align, and then this sort of ideal of universalism goes out of the window very quickly. And that not only affects women, of course. I mean, the Matilda effect is a special case of a broader phenomenon called the Matthew effect, which was published by Merton himself already in 1968 in a paper in Science. And it's named after the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew in the Bible, from which this quote here comes, which is, "For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have abundance. But for him who has not, even that he has will be taken away." So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And this is the sort of dynamic that happens when prestige and recognition is assigned in science. So science is not a meritocracy, but people who are well known are much more likely to become credited for some achievement. Another way to express this is Stigler's law of eponymy, published in a festschrift to Robert Merton, actually, in 1980. And that is, no scientific discovery is named after its original discoverer. Of course, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's a nice way of putting it. So eponymy, of course, is the sort of phenomenon that theories get named after their inventors. Darwin's theory of evolution, Darwinian theory, Newtonian mechanics, and so on. So he says no scientific discovery is really named after its original discoverer, but always after some sort of famous person that is being remembered. So the Matilda effect is a special case of the Matthew effect and Stigler's law of eponymy. And it is a really serious deviation from meritocracy in science. It goes back a long time. So first case of the Matilda effect that I found here is Trotta of Salerno, who was a medical practitioner in the 12th century in Italy. And she published a whole compendium of cures that was integrated into a bigger compendium that was named after her. It's called the Trotula. But she herself, as a person, as a historical person, faded into the background and became sort of fictional until she was rediscovered in the 20th century. And it's very unusual, of course. You have to appreciate how unusual it is that a woman is being accepted as a medical authority this early in human history. Um, Here you have Nettie Stevens. Do you know her? She discovered sex chromosomes. She's also the first person who could ever associate a difference in the chromosomes of an organism with a phenotype. She studied mealworms and found that mealworms with large sex chromosomes always became female, while mealworms with small sex chromosomes always became male beetles. And so her insight was later attributed to Edmund Wilson, who actually never studied female beetles, only studied the males. Or even more so, T.H. Morgan, who himself, when writing the obituary of Nettie Stevens, contributed very much to the revision of history, saying that her contribution was rather minor in this case. Marie Curie even almost failed to get her Nobel Prizes because she was a woman and she never managed to become a member of the Academy of Sciences in France. Lisa Meitner discovered nuclear fission together with Otto Hahn, who got the Nobel Prize in 1944, and she got nothing. Probably being Jewish, apart from being a woman, wasn't helping either at the time. Rosalind Franklin is such a famous case that I barely need to say anything. I mean, she was obscured by those guys. Watson and Crick that looked into her drawers of unpublished results to get their model of DNA, and then never acknowledged her for the work. And by the way, both Rosalind Franklin and Nettie Stevens died tragically early from cancer. So did Marie Curie, of course. So these women literally gave their lives to science without being recognized properly. Or Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who in her PhD actually discovered pulsars, and her supervisors got the Nobel Prize 1974 for her discovery, and she wasn't mentioned. Ironically, here is Harriet Zuckerman, who together with Robert Merton developed the account of the Matthew effect, but didn't somehow make it onto the paper in 1968 in Science. So the Matthew effect produced the Matilda effect when it was first published. So this, of course, doesn't just apply to women, but any minority in science, and also junior researchers that are generally, very generally, just overlooked in favor of more famous researchers. So there's all kinds of biases in the way we attribute credit and prestige in science. And there is all kinds of biases in which the contributions of different perspectives are acknowledged. And so this leads us to the sort of feminist approach to epistemology and the sociology of science. And a really great pioneer in this field was Helen Longino, who wrote this wonderful book called Science as Social Knowledge, where she examines sort of the influence of values ideology on objectivity in science. And she, through her analysis, arrives at the conclusion that the distorting social assumptions that we just laid bare that are active in science, they cannot be separated from science itself. So science ultimately is a very human activity. And this claim that a positivist would have made, that you have the practice of doing science and then you have the context of assessing science, and the scientific method makes sure that these biases are filtered out. She says that is not possible. You cannot filter out those biases. They are deeply embedded in the activity of doing science. And so she focuses on the background assumptions that influence what facts are used as evidence for in different fields of science, and concludes that interpretation of facts is strongly influenced by social values. And that is particularly bad, of course, in fields that affect minorities, where these minority points of views are not acknowledged. For example, women's experience of sexism and anti-sexist movements leads to novel presuppositions, resulting in a body of feminist science. Okay, let's try and make that a little bit more concrete. So Longino used as examples, for example, the study of sex and gender, of course. Or also we could use as an example the theory of mating choice in evolution, which is largely traditionally focused on male mating choice. And nobody for a long time asked how females, they're just there, they get chosen, but they don't choose, right? So that's an example of a bias that creeps into a scientific sort of project. And this leads us to standpoint epistemology, which is a sort of very similar to perspectival epistemology, which was developed in the context of a feminist approach to science by, among a lot of other people, Sarah Harding, Nancy Hartsock, and Donna Haraway that are depicted here. So the main point here is that because of their experiences and social values, certain people can have standpoints that are privileged perspectives. And this is a theory that uses their terms in a very sort of ironic sense. So a privileged perspective is a perspective that encounters problems that other people do not encounter. So for example, women experience discrimination, and this experience allows them to better understand aspects of gender relations that remain invisible from the male perspective, that is usually called the privileged perspective. So males are privileged, they don't see the problem. So this makes female perspectives on the problem privileged in that they see the problem in the first place. I hope you get that sort of playful reversal of meanings here. So a privileged perspective is exactly that of the minority that is privileged exactly because it sees and experiences more problems than those that are actually privileged in society. And so a standpoint is not merely an interested but an engaged perspective. So you are engaged with the problems that you encounter, and the people who don't encounter that problem obviously don't engage with it. So it's a difference in engagement. And more generally, you can apply this, of course, not just to feminist aspects of doing science, but it applies to people for whom social constraints are oppressive. So they can just more easily understand those constraints than others. Okay, and that is what privileged perspectives are. So these are perspectives that are brought in by minorities. And I want to stress that this doesn't have to be limited to sort of questions of gender and race and sexual orientation and all that, but it can, anyone with a weird sort of out there view of the world can have very privileged perspectives, and every individual can experience problems that nobody else experiences. So one of the important questions here is, what are the problems that only you experience and nobody around you sees? That's a very good way of getting a good research project, I think. So then, in another sort of twist of a term, standpoint epistemology says that if you want to increase objectivity, in the sense of if you want to a maximally grounded sort of knowledge, then you need to have communities of researchers that are as diverse, representative, and democratic as possible, okay? Because otherwise you're missing privileged perspectives, you're missing part of the picture. And so you have less objective views. And so they call this strong objectivity, again, in a playful reversal of what a objectivist realist, of course, would think is strong objectivity. So strong objectivity here is sort of based on the broadest sort of range of subjective privileged perspectives. And again, we arrive back at this very sort of perspectival view, and a sort of a reason why it is important to have a very diverse, not a very sort of streamlined, but a very diverse, representative, and democratic scientific community. Now, standpoint epistemology can be taken very far. It's often taken to the point by postmodernist scholars where they say, okay, if you don't have a privileged perspective, you cannot understand the problem at all if you haven't experienced. I have my problems with that, okay? I don't think that's a very useful view. I think a privileged perspective is an ability to bring a problem to the table and to the discussion. And it's very well possible for people who have not experienced a certain problem to understand it. So think about it. If you want to fix world hunger, you don't have to have experienced hunger in your own life. Okay, so malnutrition isn't a prerequisite for you to understand the problem and to be able to solve it. And so I think it's very important to keep the discussion outside these sort of isolated minority communities. But the point here is not to sort of say, okay, only women can solve women's problems. Quite the contrary. The idea here is to say, we have to listen to people who experience a certain problem because they have unique insights into that problem that if you haven't experienced that problem, you certainly haven't had before. And this is how you widen your horizon, again, by trying to adopt the perspective of someone else. That's very important and very different from the sort of postmodern interpretation of, if you are not Black, you cannot talk about racism. I think that's a very sort of pernicious interpretation of this standpoint. Epistemology, it's often used for that. So I don't like that and want to distance myself from that point of view. Okay, so we've arrived at this sort of insight that it's crucial to have as much diversity as possible in a scientific community. But of course, that's a problem in the current scientific system. That's inefficient. You have a lot of quabbling, different opinions, of controversies, all kinds of diverging points of view. Isn't that bad? Shouldn't we always arrive at a sort of a singular, sort of a consensus? So should we aim for consensus in science? This is the last question I'm going to touch on today. And again, we're going back to Robert Merton. A lot of the sort of questions we discussed today go back to his work. And again, a quote about universalism, universality in science. Sooner or later, Merton says, competing claims to validity are settled by universalistic criteria. And again, I mean, universalism is just sort of the point that, a claim shouldn't be judged on the person, but just on the arguments that person makes, right? And so that is often still viewed as sort of very important in science. But I mean, we've so much of this course has been dealing with the problem of underdetermination, that we just don't have enough available evidence to choose among competing theories, the unobservables, especially of those theories. And so if we accept that fact that we'll always have multiple valid explanations for a certain phenomenon, is it really useful to aim for consensus? So I think Merton's consensus criterion in science is generally overrated. And there is a beautiful paper by John Beattie and Alfred Moore from 2010 entitled, Should We Aim for Consensus?, that shares this view. They say there can be excellent reasons for calling into question the authority of a group of scientists, but those reasons do not include lack of unanimity among them. That's an interesting point of view and maybe a bit surprising. So let's see what more they have to say about this. They say unanimity can actually be pernicious. It can be bad, because if it's the sort of unanimity that is used to project authority, it can actually suppress scientific deliberation. Okay, so if you must appear unified in front of the public to be taken serious, that is a problem. By covering up the disagreement, you affect the quality of scientific deliberation. What do I mean by that? So there are different ways of discussing, right? And I would say the standard view of science and knowledge, the traditional view of science, is based on, this idea that there's only one explanation of the world as it really is. And what we use, therefore, often to settle arguments or controversies in that sort of mode of thinking is a debate, right? You have two people, they have arguments and they go against each other, and then you see who is more convincing, you vote, and then we settle on the majority view. Okay, that's a debate. There are winners, there's one opinion that will come out as the winner and one point of view that comes out as the loser in a debate. A deliberation is a very sort of different way of discussing, where we are trying to find common ground. We accept the fact that people can have valid perspectives, different perspectives on a certain topic. We try to find out why that happens. We try to find out common ground and how to move on from there. And there is a very, very important point I want to make about pluralism in science. First of all, underdetermination doesn't mean that you can have sort of any sort of idea, okay? We established very well in this lecture that pluralism needs to be justified. You need to be able to argue that you have a valid perspective on a certain problem that actually is helpful under certain circumstances. And we have criteria such as robustness to say, okay, this view is really not as robust as that view, and we can rank those. Okay, so there are two different kinds of pluralism. Bernstein called those flabby pluralism, which is just sort of everybody's entitled to their opinion, and engaged pluralism, which is the sort of pluralism where we argue not just against each other, but where we say, okay, this is the reason why we disagree, and we're trying to find out why. We find out the common ground, and we try to find out how to move ahead from there. That is deliberation. Okay, so when you accept this as a fruitful way of doing science, suppressing different opinions encourages agreement where there is none, as we said before, and it also misleads the public and undermines the epistemic quality of the deliberators, because those minority views are suppressed in favor of the majority view. But if you're a perspectivist, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? So this is what is meant by undermining the epistemic equality of deliberators, is that minority views are suppressed. And the last problem here, of course, is that it unfairly privileges the status quo. If you go for the majority view in the debate, I mean, most new insights in science are not starting out as a majority view. So it's really hard to become a majority view if you're constantly suppressed. And so deliberation is a more fruitful way in this perspectivist view of science to move forward. Okay, dissenting minorities in this view can be very beneficial in science, very necessary. What matters is the quality of deliberation, which is actually enhanced by non-dismissible minorities. So by minority positions that have valid arguments, again, engaged pluralism, not flabby pluralism, okay? So a fruitful debate, fruitful arguments, different opinions, controversies, that's a good thing if we go about it the right way, if we don't bash each other over the head with our arguments, but use deliberation to move productively forward. This is a huge problem. If you've ever been to a scientific meeting, you know that it's not very common to deliberate. And it's much more common to talk past each other. And many, many controversies in science are pseudo controversies that just come about from a misunderstanding, basically, of objectivist realists going against each other, while not knowing that both of the interpretations they have of reality is actually completely valid. So there's a sort of a balance to be had between flabby pluralism, too much pluralism, and this sort of engaged reasoned pluralism and the mode of debating. And so what they say, Beatty and Moore, they say if authority requires unanimity, then there is not much hope for it in democratic politics, especially, or in science, because we don't often agree. And that is a reflection of how we go about knowing about the world. It's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. What matters is not consensus, unanimity, but deliberative acceptance. That's a beautiful concept. And that is a consensus on the quality of the deliberative process. So even if we disagree, we can still agree that we had a good deliberation and we were heard, even if we are in the end in the minority. So I end with this beautiful quote from the paper that says, the very transparency that has been seen as a threat to scientific authority by revealing a lack of unanimity is actually a requirement for authority. It is the unanimity requirement that is the problem. What we want to know is that there was indeed disagreement, even to the end, but that by its own account, the minority was heard. We don't need to come to an agreement, but we need to agree that everybody was heard and that there was a good deliberation. So in this sense, let's democratize science. We need a more diverse and more deliberative sort of science. Deliberation is used in the democratization of political processes. We need to do the same for scientific processes. We need to democratize how we get to the insights that we get. And with that, I want to conclude and thank you that you have lasted till the end. What I have tried here is to move away from the sort of standard view of science and knowledge that is still embedded in many heads today to a more, let's say, empirically grounded view of how science is done, which is sort of based on an examination of the process of doing science and the different perspectives that go into doing science. It's an attempt at sort of balancing between unrealistic objectivist claims to absolute truth and dangerous relativism, where we lose truth in a post-truth world, which leads to all kinds of problems. We can achieve reliable knowledge We have to look at the way we achieve it by the social sort of and individual processes that achieve it. But it is possible to distinguish in every historical and social context what is more trustworthy and what is not. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed this sort of menu of points. Again, it's a crash course. I could only present very superficially a lot of different, hopefully inspiring sort of aspects of doing philosophy and also sociology of science. I hope that you were fascinated by some of them, and you can go and look up the references that I've been giving for further information on the views that I've presented. And also, these lectures are only discussion starters. I'm giving a course where we extensively discuss each one of those lectures in sort of 5 half-day modules with 2 follow-up sessions. So if you're interested in getting that course to your institution, there's more information on my website, which is listed here, or you write me an email or direct message me on Twitter. My tag is below. And sort of how this course works is that we take these lectures as a sort of a discussion starter where we try to engage with the problems that the participants bring to the course and that are important to them in their own local setting. Okay, with that, I want to thank you again for listening. I hope this was helpful. I hope it changes something in the world. And well, that's it. Bye now.